For forearm pronation, the client will be seated with the humerus adducted, the elbow at 90 degrees, and the forearm in mid-position. The axis of the goniometer is at the ulnar border of the dorsal aspect of the wrist, just proximal to the ulnar styloid. The movable bar is resting against the dorsal aspect of the wrist, and the stationary bar is perpendicular to the floor. After the forearm is pronated, reposition the goniometer so that the movable bar rests squarely across the center of the dorsum of the distal end of the forearm. Appropriate range of motion for forearm pronation is 0 to 90 degrees. For the alternative method of forearm pronation, the patient will be seated as before. In this method, a pencil will be placed in the hand so that it is held perpendicular to the floor. The axis of the goniometer is placed over the head of the third metacarpal. The stationary bar is perpendicular to the floor. Once the forearm is pronated, the movable bar will be parallel with the pencil. Appropriate range of motion is 0 to 90 degrees. For forearm supination, the patient will be seated with the humerus adducted, the elbow at 90 degrees, and the forearm in mid-position. The goniometer axis is at the ulnar border of the palmar aspect of the wrist, just proximal to the ulnar styloid. The movable bar is resting against the palmar aspect of the wrist, and the stationary bar is perpendicular to the floor. When the patient supinates the forearm, the goniometer should be repositioned so that the movable bar rests squarely across the center of the distal end of the forearm. Appropriate range of motion for supination is 80 to 90 degrees. For the alternative method of supination, the patient will be seated as before. In this method, you will place a pencil in the client's hand so that it is held perpendicular to the floor. The axis of the goniometer will be placed over the head of the third metacarpal, and the stationary bar is perpendicular to the floor. When the patient supinates the forearm, the movable bar will be parallel to the pencil. Appropriate range of motion is 0 to 90 degrees.
The client is seated with the humerus adducted, the elbow flexed to 90 degrees, and the forearm pronated. The therapist stands in front of the client or next to the client on the side to be tested. Provide stabilization at the humerus just proximal to the elbow. Palpate the client over the supinator muscle on the dorsal lateral aspect of the forearm, below the head of the radius. The muscle can be best felt when the radial muscle group is pushed out of the way. The therapist may also palpate the biceps at the middle of the anterior surface of the humerus. Observe the client supinating the forearm, turning the hand palm up. Because gravity assists movement, after the 0-degree neutral position is passed, the therapist may apply slight resistance equal to the weight of the forearm. Provide resistance by grasping around the dorsal aspect of the distal forearm with the fingers and heel of the hand while turning the arm toward pronation. The client is seated shoulder flexed to 90 degrees and the upper arm resting on the supporting surface, elbow flexed to 90 degrees. The forearm is in full pronation in a position perpendicular to the floor. The therapist stands next to the client on the side to be tested. Provide stabilization at the humerus just proximal to the elbow. Palpate the supinator or biceps. Observe the client supinating the forearm, turning the palm of the hand toward the face. The client is graded according to standard definitions of muscle grades. The client is seated with the humerus adducted, the elbow flexed to 90 degrees, and the forearm in full supination. The therapist sits beside the client on the side to be tested. Provide stabilization at the humerus just proximal to the elbow to prevent shoulder abduction. Palpate the pronator teres on the upper part of the volar surface of the forearm, medial to the biceps tendon, and diagonally from the medial condyle of the humerus to the lateral border of the radius. Observe the client pronating the forearm, turning the hand palm down. Slight resistance may be applied after the arm has passed mid-position to compensate for the assistance of gravity after that point. Provide resistance by grasping over the dorsal aspect of the distal forearm, using the fingers and heel of hand and turning toward supination. The client is seated, shoulder flexed to 90 degrees, elbow flexed to 90 degrees, and the forearm in full supination. The upper arm is resting on the supporting surface, and the forearm is perpendicular to the floor. The therapist stands next to the client on the side to be tested. Palpate the pronator teres. Observe the client pronating the forearm, turning the palm of the hand away from the face. The client is graded according to standard definitions of muscle grades.